When first asked if I could have an extremely short homily on Super Bowl Sunday, I decided to do two of them. First is the extremely short one. We need to have the patience of Job, period. Now the one that I plan to give you. It's a little bit longer. Those of you that know me, this little bit might be a bit of an understatement. But there's that phrase, the patience of Job. And I should introduce that phrase with a caveat, a great lawyer term that we use. The caveat is that I'm the least likely person to speak with you about the virtue of patience. At least a handful of you know me well enough to know that patience for me is, well, non-existent, the way that we use the term. In fact, I'm frequently asked, "Oh, Father, do you have any patience?" And I'll say, "I'm an attorney and I'm an ordained priest. I had clients, now I have parishioners. Doctors have patience, I have no patience." Of course, we know the word patience, plural like that, and patience with the CE on the end of it mean totally different things. It must be really difficult for people who learn English as a second language. They're just exactly the same sounding word, but it's that second version, patience. We know it the minute that we hear it, and I'm the least likely person to speak to you about it because, well, I'm just so impatient. That would almost make me hesitant to do it for fear of hypocrisy. But the other thing, I told you I'm an ordained priest. Wouldn't that be the surprise of the century if somebody from Hollywood Casting came in here tonight while the priest was watching the Super Bowl? I really am the ordained priest, 22 years and counting, and I've heard 22 years worth of confessions, and the amazing thing is literally every human being that comes to confession confesses the sin of impatience. It's as rampant as the common cold. It's around everywhere, and that gave me a sense that I could perhaps talk about it. You know, when we all struggle with what we think the virtue of patience is, sometimes we'll even say, "I wish I had the patience of Job." Well, you're about to learn that that does not mean what we use that idiom to mean. So let's talk about the book of Job. It's not often that one of our first readings will come from there, and it does tonight, but we only get this little small part in the 7th chapter, and we really need the full context to appreciate Job, which is one of the most marvelous of wisdom literature that we have. Job is well known among those who read the Old Testament because the story seems to ask the all-important question, why does God allow bad things or evil things to happen to good people? And many people go to the book of Job for their answer and seem disappointed afterwards because the question is indeed asked, the book is about that, but the question goes completely, totally unanswered. But it's a relevant question, so let's talk about Job the man. Job, we're told at the very beginning, was a righteous man, one of the most righteous in Israel. And then immediately God and the devil, the demons, are having a conversation. Isn't that interesting? Because Jesus in Mark's gospel tonight tells the demons to shut up while he's preaching. So clearly these two do know each other. God and the demons are having a conversation, and God brags about Job, what a righteous and good person he is. And the demons say that if we could take his things away from him, he wouldn't be so good and righteous. It's said a little more lyrically in the book, but you get the idea. And so Job's livestock dies. His farm gets into trouble. It's economic disaster. It's a mess. But then we're told Job still refuses to curse God. Then the demons come back to God. They say, if you will let us harm his physical body, then he will surely curse you. And God gives them again permission to do this. And so we learn that Job is covered from head to toe with boils. If you can imagine such a thing. What a horrible, wretched condition. And many, many other afflictions. So he's quite aware something has gone wrong. He doesn't understand it. He can't think of anything that he's done wrong. How can he possibly have fallen out of favor with God? So his wife comes along. She's the first character in the story that comes into the story. And she says he's basically a pitiful mess. I'm paraphrasing here. That there's no point in him going on. He might as well just simply curse God and die. Boy, that's a nice wife, isn't it? It's also the last we hear of her. She disappears, never to be found again. You'll pick up another one a little later in the story. Hang in there. Then 3 of Job's friends come. They come to cheer him up. There's 3 of them, and this is so typical when you and I try to speak with someone who's going through any type of grief. We almost always ham-handedly say the wrong thing. And all 3 of the friends of Job do the exact same thing. They ultimately reach the conclusion that his situation is awful. He already had his wife to tell him that it's beyond hope. I think his wife told him that one too, that he should go on and curse God and die. And he said, I've seen this song before. Ultimately, the 3 men are sent away. They're friends that were not able to resonate with Job in his suffering. Then God visits Job. This is quite the story, all these visitings. And when God visits Job, this is why people think the book of Job is about the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Because Job asks God that question. It's right in, there's a debate with him. It's much longer than I'm giving tonight, but you get the gist of the idea that Job is raging and he's angry and he's got all of these things, all that stuff that you say in the back of your mind. If I ever had a private moment with God, just him and me in the room, there's a lot of stuff I really want to ask him. Well, that's exactly what Job does. And God, being God, meaning perfect control of emotions, not going to be offended in any way, shape, or form, and not going to be altered in his plan in any way, shape, or form, just simply refuses to answer. The Reader's Digest condensed version of God's answer to Job is basically, I am God, and God is God, and you don't understand God's ways. And that's it. And so Job finally comes up with the pearl of wisdom that is frequently used when you quote the book of Job. He says, well, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. God gives, God takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. You see, ultimately, Job becomes at peace with God being God and Job being Job, and Job not understanding why bad things happen to good people. All he understands is that God is the purpose of his life. In the end, it's faith. Job's faith remains unshaken. He's angry with God. He wants things to change. That doesn't affect our faith, but his belief in who God is and what God's purpose is never changes. And now you know what the patience of Job is. It's not, do you wait well in a grocery line? Who does? Or wait well in traffic? Does anybody really do that? Or my favorite, on one of those technical support or customer service telephone lines where everyone commits a mortal sin before the conversation's over. Patience isn't about any of those things. Patience is about letting God be God as an act of faith. It's illustrated more dramatically in the gospel story tonight. The details at the beginning won't be obvious to anyone that's not visited the places I have, but it's so clearly there. Jesus was speaking in the synagogue, and when he left, he went over to Peter's house. You heard that at the very beginning. What you don't know is this all takes place in the town of Capernaum. It's a first century town that has still remained a first century town. People don't live there. In fact, on a daily basis before the pandemic, hordes of pilgrims come on a daily basis, and that's the whole purpose of Capernaum, to be a place for pilgrims and tourists to see all the things that are there to see. We visited that synagogue. I've been there on 2 trips now to the Holy Land, and what's left of the synagogue is just some ruins. As you stand in there, it's really much smaller than the church you're sitting in tonight, and all you know is that Jesus walked in there and said, today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And in that gospel we got to last week where he forces a demon out of somebody who's right there in that little church, that all happened in that place. Our tour guide, though, explained to us that what we were standing in was a 4th century synagogue. Who knew? They all look alike, right? So that the 1st century synagogue is underneath and in an archaeologically protected area, and therefore you don't see it. Kind of a disappointment, but you're kind of still standing above the spot where all of this takes place. Then they take you over to Peter's house. Lo and behold, it is still there. But the difference about Peter's house is how it's been rebuilt. Peter's house, the 1st century foundations remain, but they're encased in glass so that they can't be penetrated by except archaeologists who have the ability to go down there and not hurt the place that's there. Built on top of this magnificent edifice of what's left of Peter's house is an enormous modern Catholic church. Now, when I say modern, you have to think Israel, where modern is 3rd century, 4th century, but in this case, it's like a 1990s church. You could go out in the East End of the newer churches we build and say, that looks like the church that's on top of Peter's house, because it's just extremely modern. You'd instantly know it's a Catholic church when you see it. When you go inside, of course, the reason to go is to see Peter's house, the remains of it. You look down into the floor to see it. And then the tour guide points out to you that the room that you particularly see as you look through the glass, it's in the corner towards the front. He then tells us this would have been the privileged spot for a parent when they lived in with their children, and therefore this would be where Peter's mother-in-law was when Jesus went down, as you heard in the gospel tonight, found out that she had a fever, went to her, grabbed her by the hand, and the text says he raised her up. It's actually a bad translation. When you study the commentaries, they'll say that the Greek word that was used there in Mark is only used in two places. There where the mother-in-law is being raised up off the bed, and the other spot will be at the end of the gospel on Easter Sunday, the resurrection story. The angels will be telling the people to come to the empty tomb, he has been raised up. So in other words, saying that he helped his mother-in-law up is the understatement of the century. He raised her up. And you notice the detail? He raised her up and she began to serve and wait on them. Remember, she wasn't dead. She was just gravely ill. She went back to doing what she had done before. Not that dramatically different than Lazarus' resurrection. Now, he really was dead. But then when he's raised up, he's going to die again. So he goes back to being a human person until his inevitable death comes again. That's the raising up that happens in Simon Peter's house. But I told you it's a church, right? I told you that. Therefore, that we know on a daily basis, where it never had been done before, Eucharist is celebrated. You have to know the layout of this church. The big feature is the house, so it's the center. The church is built up above it so we can look down into that glass. Think of a circular church, that's how it works. Didn't say 1990s? So it's a very circular church. The altar and sanctuary overlooks this miraculous sight, and when the people gather together to worship, their pews on the other side overlook the same thing. It's a big circle in the middle of the floor. 3 years ago, we were in Jerusalem, and I put those pictures up, and they don't do it justice when you take a close-up. Kate, who's our lector tonight, sent a note back to me at that moment. What's this a picture of? That's what it's a picture of, Peter's mother-in-law's house. You really can't tell from my terrible picture of it, but that's really what it is. And see, what really struck me about this is that when we celebrate Eucharist on a daily basis, we celebrate Easter. That's what Eucharist is. It's about how Jesus raises us up. He helps us, yes, indeed, like that inadequate translation, but the much better translation, raised us up. That's just what happens when you and I come to Eucharist. We come to be raised up. And like everyone else, we know that we, just like Job, just like Peter's mother-in-law, we all suffer with tribulations, some minor, although they never seem minor when we're having them, and then sometimes they're major, and they most certainly seem major when we're having them. All of us wonder why these things happen, when they're going to come to an end. It's a natural part of our human wonderment and our suffering. And we bring that set of stories to Eucharist. Every time we gather together, we come with wherever our journey is at that moment. Where we are right now, what's happening in my life right now, the direction my life is going or not going, right at this moment, the challenges that I'm facing, the hope and hopes that I have about the future, my concern or anxieties about the future. These are all the things we bring to Eucharist. And each time we come forward in the communion line, we may as well be Peter's mother-in-law. Whether we have a fever or we have anxiety or we have self-doubt or we have low self-esteem, maybe we struggle with whatever we struggle with, every time we come here to receive communion, Jesus puts out his hand. That's the body of Christ. And we receive him in our hand or onto our mouth. We receive him. Don't you see? He raises us up. That's exactly what happens there. And now, admittedly, when we're raised up at communion, if it's a wonderful experience, and I hope that it is, you can still walk out the door and slip down the steps. Please don't do that. Our insurance isn't that good. But you could really do that. I mean, this doesn't mean you're going to live a charmed life afterwards. You already know that. But in the moment we're raised up, we recognize this is what God does. He raises us up. And Job learned this. He never was abandoned by God. He was always there with him in his suffering. In the very end, when it reached its absolute rock bottom and his wife was gone and his friends were gone, he was still with God. And so are we. The year before I went into the seminary, I've shared with you before, it was a really challenging year for me. My friend Michael was dying of AIDS, and he did die of AIDS at the end of that year. It was a horrific year of struggle. But I have not told you at the same time mine from work, Marilyn, was also struggling with an aggressive cancer. Marilyn was already at retirement age, and this cancer came as a very unwelcome surprise, as it always is with people. We knew her to be a stoic woman, which indeed she was, but her particular bout of chemotherapy and the effects afterwards were just absolutely devastating to her. She knew that I was beginning to plan to go into the seminary, and she knew about Michael dying. All of this stuff was happening at the same time. She made a decision to start journaling and sending those journals to me. I keep them. They're still there. I just read them before I prepared this homily again. Her journal is called Living with Cancer, and there's a part of it that really jumps out at me. It's when she said, I thank God now every day for my cancer. She goes, because now I recognize the blessings. I see the people I love. I see the places that I love. I see the work that I still like to do. I see them as more beautiful than I saw them before. And then, as only Marilyn could write, she said, I am seeing everything in Technicolor. I have never forgotten that. You could really say that Marilyn was raised up, even though she hadn't been healed. And she walked around with a cancer diagnosis that never came back, but she walked around with the fear that it would come back, as many cancer survivors have to walk around. She's since passed away. We learned that she had to go to a nursing home and she had dementia. And right before she was in the most serious part of her memory care, she was still on the phone with some of my friends, and she was very aware that she was losing her memory. What a terrible thing. We sadly learned she died a number of years ago, and I remember telling my friends in a group chat that we did this week, but Marilyn, the minute she died, got all of her precious memory back. Marilyn, you see, no longer would suffer. Marilyn would now receive the product and the fruit of our struggles and our toils on earth. That's called heavenly joy. And then I said, you know what? Marilyn's in heaven, and now she really does see in Technicolor. And you and I will do the very same thing. What remains for us to be seen remains for us to be seen. And the fact that it remains and we haven't seen it yet means we have something more precious than seeing it. It's called hope. And that hope, that resolution is awaiting us, a time not of our choosing, a time not of our making, it beyond our understanding when that time will come. It is the way that God has designed this world, that the time of tribulation and suffering will be brief, the time of grief will also be brief, but the time of joy will be eternal. We too will see in Technicolor. But until then, what we can do is recognize the moments Jesus is here now to raise us up now, so that we can be confident he will raise us up when it matters the most. In a moment, we're going to profess the creed, and when we do, we profess our belief in this God who made heaven and earth and will now create the life that is to come. It's every week we profess this creed. What a declaration of hope that is, that truly the best is yet to come as we profess that creed. So despite wherever your conditions bring you this evening, whatever moral state you're in or mental state you're in or psychological state you find yourselves on this particular night, simply know this, that when you hold on to the hope that's been given to you, you hold on to something really precious. That precious thing is called faith, and faith is the patience of Job.